Dungeons & Dragons is a flexible and streamlined role-playing game system, but there are a ton of rules packed in the pages of the player's handbook, many of which are pretty easy to miss.
And today we're taking a look at the 10 most common mistakes made by players and DMs.
Greetings, adventurers. My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes.
And today we're taking a look at the top 10 rules mistakes that we've noticed players and DMs make in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
Now, the rules are part of what makes Dungeons & Dragons a game, rather than just an exercise in improvised storytelling. Combined with the dice, the rules help facilitate an environment where no one, not even the Dungeon Master, really knows what's going to happen next. We think the rules are important, but they're never a straitjacket, and the Dungeon Master is always the final authority on how the rules work in play. That said, these are some pretty common mistakes that often cause confusion and sometimes even arguments at the table, and we thought that we would address them to clear up some of the confusion around the rules.
So maybe you're a brand new player who's just being introduced to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, or maybe you're a veteran player who's come over from a previous edition. Either way, with so many rules going on, it can be easy to miss a few.
Worse still, oftentimes many players adopt common house rules, which aren't actually part of the core rules of the game, but many people wrongly assume are. We're going to address some of those and more, so let's get rolling.
We're going to start off with the one rule that a lot of people get wrong, and that is calculating your armor class.
Oh man, this happens time and time again. It's a really common trip up for new players. But remember that you can only use one AC calculation when determining your armor class.
Yeah, if you are a character who has some sort of natural armor and gets to add maybe an ability score to that armor class, and then you combine that with a different ability that also adds to your armor class, you have to pick which one you're going to use.
The most common one we see this with is like a turtle lizard folk monk who wants to use their unarmored defense class feature or their natural armor class feature, or maybe gets mage armor cast on them. Those are all AC calculations, and they don't add together. You have to choose which one to use. There are some magic items that will always add to your AC, but those are raw plus values. If you ever see something that says your armor class becomes a number plus your modifier, that's a calculation, and you have to choose whether to use that versus another one.
If you're showing up to your first game and your first level character has an AC of over 20, chances are you may have done this incorrectly, and you may want to go back and see what your calculations are for your AC and choose which one to use.
The next most common mistake, and this is one on the part of Dungeon Masters, is that there is no such thing as a surprise round in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
Yeah, a lot of people make this mistake. They call it a surprise round. There is the element of gaining surprise, but it's not a full round of combat.
No, in fact, it's a condition that's applied to a creature. So in the first round of combat, some creatures might be surprised, which prevents them from taking actions on their turn in combat, but everyone still rolls initiative, and the creatures that are surprised just have their turn skipped.
I find that this helps differentiate it because instead of it being a catch-all where it's like either everybody is surprised or everybody is not surprised, it actually has it kind of break up into certain people who are surprised, which kind of adds more flow and intensity to that battle.
The other important thing with surprise is that it should be difficult to obtain. You shouldn't surprise a creature just because you were the first one to draw your sword in a difficult negotiation. There needs to be a little bit more subtlety or deception or stealth or some kind of distraction that enables that surprise rather than just being the most impetuous person in the room.
Also keep in mind that being surprised has no effect on saving throws or your armor class.
Yeah, so if you get fireballed while you're surprised, you don't have disadvantage on your saving throw.
Our third one is casting a spell as a bonus action. And I get this one asked to me all the time. If you cast a spell as a bonus action, you cannot cast another spell as your action. You can only cast a cantrip with your main action after using your bonus action to cast a spell.
This most commonly applies to, say, a sorcerer using the quicken spell Metamagic. So if you quicken a spell to cast Fireball, then the only spell that you could cast with your main action would be, say, Firebolt or Shocking Grasp.
Yeah. Now, if I cast a cantrip as my bonus action, can I cast a spell as my full action?
No, in fact, you can only still cast another cantrip. So be careful with this one and make sure that if you're casting a spell as a bonus action, make that a real spell rather than having the cantrip be the one that you quickened. The next one is a kind of a corner case, but one that often confuses both new and veteran players alike. Temporary hit points don't stack. They're not cumulative. So if you gain temporary hit points from multiple different sources, say for instance you are a Fiendish Pack Warlock and you kill 3 goblins in one turn, you only get temporary hit points from the first goblin. They don't all stack together. I've seen many cases of like a Reaper of Foes that thinks, I have 200 hit points now because I slew all these goblins. Those don't stack up.
So once you deplete the hit points, the temporary hit points, then the next goblin you kill will gain you some more back.
Yeah, you only have temporary hit points equal to the largest single pool you were granted. So if you had 5 temporary hit points and then something else granted you 10, you would have 10 temporary hit points total, not 15. The one thing to be aware of is that there actually are some spells and effects that will increase your maximum hit points. The really common combination is using the aid spell alongside an effect that grants temporary hit points, like Inspiring Leader. These effects do stack because one's granting an increase to your maximum hit points and one's granting temporary hit points. So be aware when things like this are an exception.
Next up, we have the rules on natural 1s and 20s. And here's the interesting part. There is no such thing as a crit or a crit fail when you are doing an ability check or a saving throw.
Yeah. Critical failures on a natural 1 and critical success on a natural 20 only apply to an attack roll or a death saving throw. It is still possible to succeed on an ability check or saving throw when you roll a natural 1 if your modifier is high enough.
Also, just because you roll 20 on an ability check doesn't mean you can do something impossible.
Or even implausible. For instance, if you're trying to convince the king to give up his kingdom and you roll a natural 20 on your persuasion check, probably doesn't mean he's going to do that. It probably just means he won't execute you for even suggesting it. So this is really common for dungeon masters, but players, you should change your expectations of this. A natural 20 doesn't mean something magical immediately happens that would not normally be possible. It either means that you did it really, really well, or you avoid the negative consequences of trying to take such a foolish action.
The inverse is also true here, and if you roll a 20, there are some circumstances where you still will not succeed, and you will actually horribly fail the check that you're making.
Finally, there's no such thing as a fumble or a critical failure table in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. So if you are playing a campaign with fumble rules, just remember that is a house rule that your dungeon master is applying, and we recommend talking really carefully with your group of whether you want to use such a house rule, because those things can actually work against the players more often than not. The next one is a really rare corner case, but it slipped up many players, and this is the fact that in order to ready a spell, you must concentrate on it while you're doing so, and the mere act of readying a spell requires that you cast it. This means that if a player says, I want to cast Fireball the moment that guy goes for his sword, in order to do that, that player has to already be casting Fireball, and they're holding like the spell energy in their hands, visible to everyone around them, and it requires their concentration. So if you say you do that, but you are concentrating on Wall of Fire at the same time, that's gone poof.
This also means that if you are attacked while readying a spell, you do have to make a concentration check, which means you could lose the spell altogether.
And if the conditions that you specified for readying the spell don't occur, you also lose the spell because you've already cast it. So be really careful when you're deciding to ready an action to cast a spell, because there's a lot of extra rules baggage there.
Next up, we have one that I've seen a few people get wrong, and that is that an extra attack does not mean that you get an extra action.
Several classes like fighters, barbarians, and paladins gain the extra attack class feature, which lets them make an additional attack when they take the attack action on their turn. But I've seen many new players get confused by this because they think that it lets them take more than one action. This is not the case.
If you're playing, let's say, a ranger, and you cast a spell, and then you want to make an attack afterwards, this doesn't apply. The spell is your action for the turn, and the extra attack only applies when you make the attack action on your turn.
That said, when you do make the attack action and you have the extra attack class feature, you can replace one or both of the attacks with something like the shove action instead, or the grab action. So you can punch someone and then grab them or try to knock them over.
The rules will state this very clearly, though, that you can replace an attack action with one of these.
Mm-hmm. The next most common rule mistake comes in the form of combining effects. This is when you try to have two identical spells or named effects. Only the most powerful one applies. They don't stack together.
For example, if you have the Bless spell cast on you by two different players, it doesn't stack up. You only get the benefits of 1d4. You cannot roll 2d4 for Bless because that would be outrageous.
Or for instance, maybe you have two paladins in your party and both of them are generating the Aura of Protection, which adds your charisma modifier to saving throws. You would only add the paladin with the higher charisma modifier, not adding both of them together. So just remember that if two effects both have the same proper name, they don't add together.
Next up we have when to apply your proficiency bonus. And this one, a few people get wrong with the differentiation between your attack roll and your damage roll.
Your proficiency bonus almost exclusively applies to attack rolls, ability checks, and saving throws to which you have proficiency. It only very rarely applies to things like a damage roll. There are some cases where it does, but they're very specific class features. And many times I see new players think that their strength modifier for their attack roll, which is usually their proficiency bonus plus their strength modifier, is in the same number they add to their damage roll, when in reality it's just the strength modifier.
When creating your character, it will very specifically use the word proficiency next to the things that you will gain proficiency in, or next to the things that you have to choose. Basically, beyond that, there's not a lot of places that you're going to add your proficiency.
Furthermore, proficiency is an all or nothing thing. If multiple sources grant you proficiency in the same thing, this doesn't make you doubly proficient. There's a few effects that let you add half your proficiency modifier or double your proficiency modifier, such as a rogue with the expertise class feature, but you don't gain expertise just because your background and your class granted you proficiency in the same skill twice. You need something specific like the expertise class feature to double your proficiency modifier.
Lastly, drinking a potion requires an action.
This is a crazy common house rule that we see time and time again, so much so that we've encountered players in Adventurers League and in new groups assume that you can drink a potion as a bonus action, and you cannot. It requires a full-on action to drink that potion.
If you do house rule that drinking a potion is a bonus action, you might find the players are having a very easy time with encounters. This is probably because they're consuming health potions right in the middle of combat without it having an effect on how much they get to do. So just be careful for that.
This is a really common house rule, and there's a lot of dungeon masters that swear by it, but it is a house rule, and we believe that it's one of those more house rules that seems really innocent but actually makes the game substantially easier. So if you are having problems with encounter balance and you're using this house rule, this might be the culprit.
So here we've looked at the 10 most common mistakes that we've seen in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. But all of these are the rules as written. And if you choose to house rule to change one of these to better suit the playstyle at your table, that's fine. We're just here to make sure that you know that these are the way that they're written in the book.
Yeah, plenty of people find critical success on skill checks and critical failure on saving throws a ton of fun. There's a ton of players that love being able to quaff potions left and right with their bonus actions. And if those are adding to your game, they make them a positive experience for you, go ahead and use those. Change the rules where you need to. Just be aware of how it can affect your game. And if you do play at someone else's table, remember that those are your home rules, not necessarily ones that apply to every group.
So this has been our look at the top 10 rules mistakes in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. We hope that this clears up any controversy at your table.
And of course, we could only make a list like this because we've made plenty of mistakes at our own tables in our own games. And we would love to hear about any common rules you've gotten wrong at your table in the comments below.
We have some other great videos that will help foster a positive and collaborative environment at the table, including the 7 principles for players right up over here.
And we have 10 principles for Dungeon Masters right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.